I had planned this trip for months, telling myself it would be a simple weekend away. Just me, the woods, and the peace I so rarely found in the city. I picked a section of forest that was far enough from the main roads to feel remote, but not so far that it was dangerous, or at least that's what I thought. I arrived late morning, the air crisp and heavy with the smell of pine and damp earth, the kind of smell that immediately makes you feel like you've left the world behind. My car rattled along the dirt road, kicking up clouds of red dust, and I kept my eyes on the small trail marker that told me I was on the right path. The plan was simple. Set up camp near a small creek I had read about on a hiking forum, spend a night, maybe do some fishing, and then head back early the next day. I told myself I didn't need anyone else with me. That solitude was exactly why I had chosen this spot. I parked near a large clearing, the kind of place where sunlight streamed in like a spotlight, illuminating the uneven ground and patches of wildflowers. The air was filled with birdsong, but something about it felt too loud, too constant, as though it was trying to warn me of something. I shrugged it off and began unloading my gear. A small tent, a sleeping bag, a backpack full of food, a flashlight, a hatchet, and my small camping stove. I always overpacked, just in case. The ground was soft and slightly damp, perfect for setting up the tent, and I worked quickly, securing the stakes in the soil and hammering them with a rock I had found. By the time I was done, my legs were sore, but the camp was set up neatly, almost like it had been placed there by someone who knew exactly how to avoid trouble. I decided to explore the area a little before nightfall. The creek was only a few minutes' walk away, the water clear and icy cold, flowing fast over the rocks. I knelt down and ran my hand through the current, feeling the sting of cold water, and then watched as a few small fish darted away from my fingers. It felt peaceful, and I took several deep breaths, trying to imprint the memory in my mind. The forest around me was quiet now, not silent, but every sound seemed deliberate. The rustle of leaves, the snap of a branch under an unseen animal's paw, the distant call of a hawk circling above. I told myself it was just nature, nothing more, but my stomach twisted slightly with unease. I spent the afternoon gathering firewood, choosing pieces of wood that were dry enough to burn well but heavy enough to last through the night. The sun was beginning its slow descent, spilling golden light through the trees, and I realized I had lost track of time. I built a small fire pit near the edge of the clearing, arranging the stones I found into a neat circle. I set my pile of wood beside it, feeling a small measure of satisfaction. I had done everything correctly, prepared for the night as carefully as anyone could, and yet there was a flicker of doubt in my mind, a nagging voice telling me to pay attention to the sounds around me. I shook it off, telling myself I was just being anxious. By the time night fell, the temperature had dropped sharply, the air thick with cold and damp. I lit the fire, the flames crackling and dancing, casting long, moving shadows across the clearing. I cooked a small meal on my stove, a mix of canned beans and rice, then ate slowly, listening to the forest. That was when I first noticed it. The faint sound of movement outside the clearing, soft at first, like the brush of wind through leaves, but with a deliberate rhythm, as though something was stepping carefully, deliberately, among the trees. I froze, straining to hear. The firelight stretched shadows into the darkness, and I found myself glancing over my shoulder constantly. My first thought was deer or another animal, but something about the pattern of the noise didn't make sense. It was too precise, too careful, too slow. I grabbed my flashlight and swept it across the treeline, expecting to catch the gleam of animal eyes. For a few minutes, nothing. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw movement, a shadow flitting between the trees. I tightened my grip on the flashlight and held my breath. The shadow disappeared as quickly as it had appeared, leaving only the faint crackle of leaves. My mind raced. Maybe it was a coyote or a fox. Maybe it was nothing. I told myself to calm down, to rationalize, but every instinct in my body screamed that something was wrong. I lit a second fire in my pit, adding larger logs, and watched as the flames grew taller, the heat pushing back some of the night's chill. Hours passed. I tried to sleep in the tent, but every sound, the snapping of a branch, the rustle of leaves, the occasional distant howl, kept me alert. I lay on my sleeping bag, staring at the tent ceiling, listening. Then I heard it. A low, deliberate scraping sound. Close, very close. I held my breath, straining to hear. It came again, this time followed by the faint crunch of dirt underfoot. My heart pounded in my chest. I grabbed my hatchet, keeping it close, and crept to the tent's opening, peeking outside. Nothing. Only the shadows of trees moving in the firelight. I realized then that the sounds were not random. They were circling the clearing, slow, careful, as though something or someone was walking around me, watching, waiting. I stayed completely still, forcing myself to breathe slowly, to avoid making noise. I thought about leaving, running through the forest, but the thought of moving in the dark, without knowing what was out there, made my stomach turn. My only option was to wait, to stay put and hope whatever it was would leave. Hours passed. The fire burned low, leaving me in near darkness. I kept my eyes on the tree-line, every shadow making my pulse spike. The scraping had stopped at some point, replaced by faint whispers of movement I couldn't identify. I was on edge, exhausted, yet too tense to sleep. When the first light of dawn finally began filtering through the trees, I crawled out of the tent cautiously, surveying the clearing. Everything looked normal except for the tracks. Large, heavy footprints, unmistakably human, circled the clearing. They were deep and wide, indicating someone had been walking with careful purpose all night. I packed up quickly, my hands shaking, my mind racing. I kept scanning the tree-line as I moved, imagining every rustle was the same person, following me, waiting for another chance. The walk back to the car felt endless. Every shadow, every sound, made me jump. I didn't stop until I saw the road, the first signs of civilization, and finally, my car. I locked the doors, got in, and drove straight out of the forest without looking back. Even as I drove, I kept checking the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone standing at the edge of the tree-line, watching. The memory of the footsteps, the deliberate circling, stayed with me for weeks. I knew I had been lucky. The person or people who had walked around my camp had never shown themselves fully. They had chosen not to confront me directly, but they had made their presence known, enough to make me fear for my life. I promised myself I would never go back to that forest, that I would never underestimate the quiet patience of someone willing to watch and wait in silence. It took months for me to stop thinking about that night, to stop imagining the shadowed tree-line and the slow, careful steps circling me. I started carrying pepper spray whenever I went camping after that, always making sure I had a way to defend myself, always staying closer to roads or other people. I learned the hard way that nature wasn't the only danger out there. Humans could be just as frightening and far more unpredictable. That night stayed with me, a constant reminder that even in the quietest, most peaceful places, danger could be close enough to touch. The forest had been silent, but the steps told me someone had been there, watching, calculating, waiting. And sometimes, I could still hear them in my mind, moving slowly through the leaves, circling, patient and unseen. I never went back, and I never will. I had always thought of myself as someone who could handle the wilderness. I liked the feeling of being alone in the mountains, the quiet that stretched beyond the edge of the trees, the smell of wet earth and pine needles, and the steady rhythm of my own breathing when I was far away from roads, cities, and other people. That weekend, I decided to go alone. I had no one to answer to, no plans to adjust, and no distractions. I told myself it would be a simple camping trip. 2 nights, one in a small clearing near a creek, the other on a ridge I had scouted on a map the week before. I had packed enough food for 3 days, a water filter, a small first aid kit, and extra batteries for my headlamp. My sleeping bag and tent were new, high quality, and light, perfect for solo travel. The first day went as planned. I drove to the trailhead early in the morning, parked my car, and double-checked my pack before setting off. The trail was quiet, broken only by the occasional bird call and the whisper of wind in the trees. I moved slowly, deliberately, enjoying the crunch of leaves under my boots and the cool, damp air. I reached the clearing around mid-afternoon and set up my tent near the creek. The water ran clear and fast, and I could hear it from the tent even when I closed my eyes. I spent the afternoon gathering firewood and making sure my campsite was well ordered. By the time the sun started dipping behind the ridges, I had a small fire going, cooked a simple meal, and settled down on a rock beside the creek to watch the shadows lengthen. That night, the woods were alive in a way I had never noticed before. The calls of owls were closer than I expected. Small animals rustled in the underbrush, and occasionally, I thought I saw a movement at the edge of the clearing. My heart always jumped slightly when that happened, but it was nothing I couldn't handle. I reminded myself that I was in my element. I went to sleep feeling safe, my pack close to my side, my tent zipped up tight, and my fire smoldering. I woke early the next morning to the sound of the creek and a thin, gray light slipping between the trees. I stretched, made coffee, and packed up the camp. My plan was to hike to the ridge by late afternoon, taking a longer path through a dense stretch of forest to make the journey more scenic. I moved through the woods, following faint trails, marking my progress on the map, and keeping my senses alert. The forest was quieter than usual. Even the birds were still. I told myself it was just the time of day, but a slight unease began to build. By midday, I had left the main trail completely. The path was narrow, overgrown, and littered with fallen branches. My boots slipped on wet roots and moss, and I had to carefully pick my way over rocks and logs. Around mid-afternoon, I realized I had gone further than I expected. I was confident I could find the ridge, but my surroundings were unfamiliar, and the trees all looked the same. The sun was lower in the sky than I had thought, and a chill began to creep into the air. I decided to push forward, hoping to reach a clearing where I could set up camp before it got too dark. That decision would become the first mistake. I didn't notice at first, but as the light dimmed, the forest seemed to close in around me. The trees grew thicker, the branches hung lower, and the underbrush became nearly impossible to pass without cutting my arms and legs on sharp twigs. My map showed I was close to the ridge, but I realized I had no clear landmark to confirm it. Panic began to creep in. Not the sudden, dramatic kind you see in movies, but a slow, tightening feeling in my chest, an awareness that I was alone, far from any trail, and that I could easily get lost. I decided to find a temporary place to rest and figure out my next move. I spotted a small clearing surrounded by thick trees, just large enough for my tent. I set it up quickly, making sure the entrance faced a slightly open area where I could see any movement in the forest. The air was colder now, and I built a fire immediately. The flames gave me a false sense of control, a small sphere of warmth and light against the vast darkness of the woods. I cooked another meal, eating slowly, listening to the subtle sounds around me, the branches cracking under invisible weight, the rustle of leaves, the movement of something unseen. That night was the first time I felt real fear. I woke several times to noises just outside my tent. At first, I tried to convince myself it was deer or raccoons, but there was something deliberate in the sounds, a scraping and sniffing that made me freeze in the middle of my sleeping bag. My heart pounded in my chest, and I could feel sweat pooling at the small of my back despite the cold. I didn't sleep well, if at all. Every snap of a branch, every rustle of leaves made me jump. I stayed awake for hours, huddled in my sleeping bag, staring at the fire and hoping it would not go out. The next morning, I faced the consequences of my decisions. I had not eaten well, I was exhausted, and my sense of direction was worse than ever. I realized I had no clear path to the ridge. I was trapped in a dense part of the forest with no landmarks, and I had made no mental note of my route as I came in. My pack was still full, but my energy was depleted. I tried to move cautiously, cutting through underbrush and marking trees with small strips of cloth I had packed, but the forest seemed endless, each clearing looking exactly like the last. By mid-morning, I realized something even worse. I had lost my water filter. It must have fallen from my pack when I stumbled over a root or brushed against a tree. That meant I could not safely drink from the creek without risking serious illness. My only options were to backtrack through the dense forest, hoping I could find the path I had followed, or to keep moving in a random direction and hope to find the ridge or another creek. My instincts told me to backtrack, but the forest looked completely unfamiliar in daylight. By late afternoon, I was exhausted and thirsty. My steps became slower and more deliberate. Every hill I climbed revealed nothing but more dense forest. The sun was sinking fast. I found a small depression in the ground and decided I would have to camp again, no matter how unsafe it felt. I tried to build a fire, but the wood was damp, and it took forever to catch a spark. By the time the fire was burning, I was shivering violently. My hands were raw from cutting through branches, my boots were soaked, and my stomach growled from hunger. That night, the noises outside the tent were closer, louder, and more persistent. I barely slept, listening to the scrape of claws on branches, the low growl of something large moving through the forest. I was certain something was out there, but I had no weapon, only my pack, a small knife, and a headlamp with a dying battery. The third day was the turning point. I woke with a splitting headache and a fever. My throat burned from dehydration, and I could barely lift my pack. I forced myself to move, knowing that staying in the same place meant certain danger. I decided to follow the sound of water, hoping a stream would lead me out. The ground was muddy, my boots heavy, and my body screamed with each step. I stumbled over roots and rocks, scraping my knees and elbows. Every shadow made me flinch, every branch cracking under my own weight made my heart leap. Hours passed like this. Eventually, I found a small stream, almost hidden under overgrown brush. I drank a little water cautiously, using my hands to strain debris, and followed it downstream, hoping it would lead to a larger creek or trail. My body was failing me. I stumbled constantly, nearly collapsed more than once, but I kept moving, telling myself that standing still meant giving up. Around mid-afternoon, I caught a glimmer of something unusual: cut marks on trees and trampled grass. I followed them cautiously, hoping it was a human trail. It was. By early evening, I emerged from the dense forest onto a narrow hiking path, marked by tire tracks and small signs. I could see the ridge I had intended to reach, and more importantly, I could see a small ranger station in the distance. Relief was overwhelming. I stumbled down the path, my body shaking, my vision blurred, but I kept going. At the ranger station, I was greeted by people who immediately noticed my condition. Dehydrated, bruised, and exhausted. They gave me water, food, and first aid. I stayed there overnight, recovering slowly, and told them everything that had happened. In the end, I survived because I refused to give up. I learned that the forest does not forgive mistakes, and that even experienced hikers can make deadly errors when they overestimate their abilities and underestimate the environment. The fear I felt in those 3 days was real, sharp, and unrelenting, but it forced me to focus, adapt, and survive. When I finally returned home, I felt changed. I no longer romanticized the wilderness. I respected it, and I understood that every step in the forest could be dangerous if you lose your way, lose your supplies, or simply underestimate the power of isolation. That experience stayed with me for years, a constant reminder that fear is not something to ignore, and preparation is never enough on its own. I never camped alone again, and I never wandered into unmarked forest without letting someone know exactly where I was going. I had always thought of myself as someone who could handle the wilderness. I liked the feeling of being alone in the mountains, the quiet that stretched beyond the edge of the trees, the smell of wet earth and pine needles, and the steady rhythm of my own breathing when I was far away from roads, cities, and other people. That weekend, I decided to go alone. I had no one to answer to, no plans to adjust, and no distractions. I told myself it would be a simple camping trip. 2 nights, one in a small clearing near a creek, the other on a ridge I had scouted on a map the week before. I had packed enough food for 3 days, a water filter, a small first aid kit, and extra batteries for my headlamp. My sleeping bag and tent were new, high quality, and light, perfect for solo travel. The first day went as planned. I drove to the trailhead early in the morning, parked my car, and double-checked my pack before setting off. The trail was quiet, broken only by the occasional bird call and the whisper of wind in the trees. I moved slowly, deliberately, enjoying the crunch of leaves under my boots and the cool, damp air. I reached the clearing around mid-afternoon and set up my tent near the creek. The water ran clear and fast, and I could hear it from the tent even when I closed my eyes. I spent the afternoon gathering firewood and making sure my campsite was well ordered. By the time the sun started dipping behind the ridges, I had a small fire going, cooked a simple meal, and settled down on a rock beside the creek to watch the shadows lengthen. That night, the woods were alive in a way I had never noticed before. The calls of owls were closer than I expected. Small animals rustled in the underbrush, and occasionally, I thought I saw a movement at the edge of the clearing. My heart always jumped slightly when that happened, but it was nothing I couldn't handle. I reminded myself that I was in my element. I went to sleep feeling safe, my pack close to my side, my tent zipped up tight, and my fire smoldering. I woke early the next morning to the sound of the creek and a thin, gray light slipping between the trees. I stretched, made coffee, and packed up the camp. My plan was to hike to the ridge by late afternoon, taking a longer path through a dense stretch of forest to make the journey more scenic. I moved through the woods, following faint trails, marking my progress on the map, and keeping my senses alert. The forest was quieter than usual. Even the birds were still. I told myself it was just the time of day, but a slight unease began to build. By midday, I had left the main trail completely. The path was narrow, overgrown, and littered with fallen branches. My boots slipped on wet roots and moss, and I had to carefully pick my way over rocks and logs. Around mid-afternoon, I realized I had gone further than I expected. I was confident I could find the ridge, but my surroundings were unfamiliar, and the trees all looked the same. The sun was lower in the sky than I had thought, and a chill began to creep into the air. I decided to push forward, hoping to reach a clearing where I could set up camp before it got too dark. That decision would become the first mistake. I didn't notice at first, but as the light dimmed, the forest seemed to close in around me. The trees grew thicker, the branches hung lower, and the underbrush became nearly impossible to pass without cutting my arms and legs on sharp twigs. My map showed I was close to the ridge, but I realized I had no clear landmark to confirm it. Panic began to creep in. Not the sudden, dramatic kind you see in movies, but a slow, tightening feeling in my chest, an awareness that I was alone, far from any trail, and that I could easily get lost. I decided to find a temporary place to rest and figure out my next move. I spotted a small clearing surrounded by thick trees, just large enough for my tent. I set it up quickly, making sure the entrance faced a slightly open area where I could see any movement in the forest. The air was colder now, and I built a fire immediately. The flames gave me a false sense of control, a small sphere of warmth and light against the vast darkness of the woods. I cooked another meal, eating slowly, listening to the subtle sounds around me, the branches cracking under invisible weight, the rustle of leaves, the movement of something unseen. That night was the first time I felt real fear. I woke several times to noises just outside my tent. At first, I tried to convince myself it was deer or raccoons, but there was something deliberate in the sounds, a scraping and sniffing that made me freeze in the middle of my sleeping bag. My heart pounded in my chest, and I could feel sweat pooling at the small of my back despite the cold. I didn't sleep well, if at all. Every snap of a branch, every rustle of leaves made me jump. I stayed awake for hours, huddled in my sleeping bag, staring at the fire and hoping it would not go out. The next morning, I faced the consequences of my decisions. I had not eaten well, I was exhausted, and my sense of direction was worse than ever. I realized I had no clear path to the ridge. I was trapped in a dense part of the forest with no landmarks, and I had made no mental note of my route as I came in. My pack was still full, but my energy was depleted. I tried to move cautiously, cutting through underbrush and marking trees with small strips of cloth I had packed. But the forest seemed endless, each clearing looking exactly like the last. By mid-morning, I realized something even worse. I had lost my water filter. It must have fallen from my pack when I stumbled over a root or brushed against a tree. That meant I could not safely drink from the creek without risking serious illness. My only options were to backtrack through the dense forest, hoping I could find the path I had followed, or to keep moving in a random direction and hope to find the ridge or another creek. My instincts told me to backtrack, but the forest looked completely unfamiliar in daylight. By late afternoon, I was exhausted and thirsty. My steps became slower and more deliberate. Every hill I climbed revealed nothing but more dense forest. The sun was sinking fast. I found a small depression in the ground and decided I would have to camp again, no matter how unsafe it felt. I tried to build a fire, but the wood was damp, and it took forever to catch a spark. By the time the fire was burning, I was shivering violently. My hands were raw from cutting through branches, my boots were soaked, and my stomach growled from hunger. That night, the noises outside the tent were closer, louder, and more persistent. I barely slept, listening to the scrape of claws on branches, the low growl of something large moving through the forest. I was certain something was out there, but I had no weapon, only my pack, a small knife, and a headlamp with a dying battery. The third day was the turning point. I woke with a splitting headache and a fever. My throat burned from dehydration, and I could barely lift my pack. I forced myself to move, knowing that staying in the same place meant certain danger. I decided to follow the sound of water, hoping a stream would lead me out. The ground was muddy, my boots heavy, and my body screamed with each step. I stumbled over roots and rocks, scraping my knees and elbows. Every shadow made me flinch, every branch cracking under my own weight made my heart leap. Hours passed like this. Eventually, I found a small stream, almost hidden under overgrown brush. I drank a little water cautiously, using my hands to strain debris, and followed it downstream, hoping it would lead to a larger creek or trail. My body was failing me. I stumbled constantly, nearly collapsed more than once, but I kept moving, telling myself that standing still meant giving up. Around mid-afternoon, I caught a glimmer of something unusual: cut marks on trees and trampled grass. I followed them cautiously, hoping it was a human trail. It was. By early evening, I emerged from the dense forest onto a narrow hiking path, marked by tire tracks and small signs. I could see the ridge I had intended to reach, and more importantly, I could see a small ranger station in the distance. Relief was overwhelming. I stumbled down the path, my body shaking, my vision blurred, but I kept going. At the ranger station, I was greeted by people who immediately noticed my condition. Dehydrated, bruised, and exhausted. They gave me water, food, and first aid. I stayed there overnight, recovering slowly, and told them everything that had happened. In the end, I survived because I refused to give up. I learned that the forest does not forgive mistakes, and that even experienced hikers can make deadly errors when they overestimate their abilities and underestimate the environment. The fear I felt in those 3 days was real, sharp, and unrelenting, but it forced me to focus, adapt, and survive. When I finally returned home, I felt changed. I no longer romanticized the wilderness. I respected it, and I understood that every step in the forest could be dangerous if you lose your way, lose your supplies, or simply underestimate the power of isolation. That experience stayed with me for years, a constant reminder that fear is not something to ignore, and preparation is never enough on its own. I never camped alone again, and I never wandered into unmarked forest without letting someone know exactly where I was going. I had always liked camping alone. There was a sense of freedom in being entirely responsible for myself, in taking a backpack full of supplies and finding a patch of land where I could set up a small camp and be immersed in nature. I had been careful in the past, picking spots that were accessible yet remote, where the presence of other hikers was minimal, where the silence was complete except for the sound of the wind moving through the trees or the distant call of a bird. That particular weekend, I had decided to try something new. A canyon trail I had read about online, one that promised isolation and rugged terrain. The trailhead was a few hours' drive from the last small town, and the closer I got, the more I felt the hum of normal life slipping away. The radio was off, the phone had no signal, and the road had narrowed into a dirt path, rougher than I expected. By the time I arrived at the starting point, the sun was already leaning toward the horizon, the sky painted in dull orange and gray streaks. I parked my car, checked my pack one last time, and started hiking. The first part of the trail was easy, sloping gently upward. The canyon walls towered above me, dry stone and sharp ridges. As I went deeper, the trail became rougher, the path narrower, littered with loose stones and occasional patches of dry brush. I could hear the wind moving in the canyon, whistling through narrow crevices, sometimes carrying a faint sound of running water far below. I passed a few dried-out shrubs, small desert flowers clinging to life, and the occasional rock formation that seemed almost like it had been shaped by some immense hand. I had a plan to hike a few miles, find a flat spot near a dry riverbed, and camp there for the night. I usually avoided camping too close to water unless I was certain of safety, but this canyon was dry, with only small puddles of water in depressions. I kept going, my boots crunching on the gravel, my backpack heavy but manageable. By the time I found a flat area suitable for a tent, the sky was darker, a deep indigo, and the first stars were beginning to appear. I set up my tent slowly, methodically, checking each stake and making sure it was secure against wind. I had a small camp stove, a minimal supply of dehydrated food, plenty of water, and a flashlight with extra batteries. I had been camping long enough to know that a careful setup could make a huge difference, especially when something unexpected happened. After setting up, I decided to take a short walk down to the riverbed. The canyon walls pressed in tightly here, shadows deepening as the light faded. I walked carefully, feeling the gravel shift under my boots. The quiet was intense. At first, it was calming, the sort of quiet that fills you with a strange sense of peace. But after a while, it began to feel heavy, oppressive. Each step sounded louder than it should have, echoing faintly against the rock walls. My heartbeat picked up slightly, though I tried to ignore it. I returned to my tent, cooked a small meal, and then settled down inside. The temperature was dropping fast, as it often does in desert canyons, and the cold wind whispered through the cracks in the rocks. I zipped up my sleeping bag tightly and lay back, listening to the night. Around midnight, a sudden sound woke me. At first, it was distant, like a soft thud. I froze, listening. There it was again, slightly louder this time. My first thought was an animal. Coyotes were common here, maybe a fox or even a bobcat. I tried to convince myself it was nothing serious, just wildlife going about its business. But then the sound changed. It was no longer just a thud, but a scraping, deliberate, like someone or something moving heavy rocks or debris. I unzipped the tent slightly and peered out into the darkness. My flashlight was on the small table next to me, but I hesitated to use it. The canyon was black, deeper than usual, and I couldn't see clearly. The scraping sound was moving closer, somewhere near the edge of the flat area where I had pitched my tent. My chest tightened. I thought about leaving, grabbing my backpack and hiking back to the trailhead, but the darkness and the rough terrain made that seem dangerous. I sat very still, listening. The noise stopped for a few seconds, then resumed, closer this time, slow and careful, like someone testing their footing over uneven rocks. My mind started racing through possibilities. Could it be another hiker? It was late, and I had not seen any cars or other people at the trailhead. Could it be an animal? Maybe, but the movements felt oddly purposeful, calculated. My fear was growing, that sudden spike of adrenaline that makes your muscles tense and your stomach tighten. I realized I was not thinking clearly. I reminded myself to breathe, slowly, methodically. Then I saw it. A faint outline moving across the edge of my small campsite, just beyond the glow of my flashlight. A shadow larger than any coyote, slow, methodical, crouched as if trying to stay hidden. My heart skipped a beat. My hands went cold. I wanted to call out, but the canyon walls would have carried the sound too far, and I didn't want to reveal myself. I grabbed the small hatchet I always kept in my tent, a heavy, reliable tool I had used for chopping kindling, and held it close, my hands shaking slightly. The next hour was a blur of tension. The shadow moved, stopping, crouching, circling. I stayed as still as I could, barely breathing, trying to listen to the faintest hint of what it was. I considered running, but I knew the uneven ground and darkness could cause a fall, a sprain, or worse. I considered trying to scare it off by shouting, but that could provoke whoever or whatever it was. My brain was screaming at me to do something, while my body was frozen. At some point, I realized the shadow was retreating. Slowly, carefully, it moved back toward the darkness, disappearing from view. I waited another half hour, too tense to sleep, listening to the canyon, hearing every tiny noise amplified in the still night. Only the wind and distant wildlife remained. My body gradually relaxed, though my mind remained alert, replaying the image of that shadow. I decided that as soon as daylight arrived, I would break camp and hike out, no matter how tempting it was to stay. The morning came cold and pale. I packed quickly, keeping my senses alert. Every sound seemed louder, every movement in the canyon exaggerated. I hiked down the trail with rapid, careful steps, watching the canyon walls, scanning for any sign of danger. When I reached the riverbed again, I noticed something odd. Small footprints, not animal, heading from the far side of my campsite to the darkness beyond. Human footprints. The realization hit me fully. I had not imagined the shadow. Someone had been nearby during the night, watching me, moving around my campsite. That someone had left before sunrise, disappearing without me noticing. I walked faster, my muscles tight with lingering fear, finally reaching the trailhead. My car had not been touched, the keys in the ignition exactly where I had left them. Relief washed over me, though the experience had left a heavy residue of anxiety. I drove back slowly, my eyes constantly scanning the road, every sound outside my car heightened. The town appeared eventually, with its low hum of normal life, and I felt a deep sense of safety return. I reported the footprints to the local ranger station the next day, giving them as much detail as I could. They noted that hikers occasionally reported being watched or followed, sometimes by trespassers or illegal campers, but that nothing serious had been documented recently. I realized I had been lucky. If that person had chosen a different approach, the night could have ended in disaster. From that experience, I changed how I camped. I became hyper-aware of my surroundings, avoided isolated spots without cell coverage, and always kept tools or means of defense close at hand. The canyon trail remained beautiful, awe-inspiring, and quiet, but it had a dark edge now, a reminder that nature can be unpredictable, and that human presence can be far more threatening than any wild animal. I had survived, and that survival taught me that careful preparation, situational awareness, and respect for the unknown are not just useful, they are essential. The memory of that night stayed with me. Every time I looked at the canyon walls or the dry riverbed in photos or from a distance, I remembered the feeling of being watched, the scraping sounds, the shadow moving deliberately near my tent. I told myself I had learned from it, that I was stronger for surviving it, but a part of me knew that the canyon would always hold that memory. I could never entirely forget how close I had come to danger, how fragile safety could be in an empty, dark place. I realized that camping alone was not about bravery, but about preparation, and about understanding that fear is real and must be respected. That night had been terrifying, but it had also taught me something crucial. Survival was not luck alone. It was attentiveness, caution, and the willingness to act decisively in the face of uncertainty. I had all of that, and because of it, I was able to leave the canyon in one piece, wiser and more cautious than before. I had been looking forward to this solo camping trip for months. The weeks of city noise, deadlines, and the endless pull of screens had left me craving the emptiness and quiet of the wilderness. I packed my old, battered backpack with what I thought I needed. A tent that had been with me on countless trips, a sleeping bag, a small stove, enough food for 5 days, water purification tablets, a first aid kit, a headlamp, extra batteries, a small axe, and a folding knife. I had read about the area online. The northern part of the state, a forest that stretched for miles, mostly uninhabited, with a river cutting through it and trails that few people bothered to follow. There were warnings about bears and other wildlife, but I had experience and I felt prepared. Maybe overconfident, but prepared. I arrived at the trailhead in the early morning. The sun was just beginning to crest over the distant hills, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. I parked the car on a rough patch of dirt next to a faded sign warning hikers that the trail was remote and challenging. I checked my pack once more, tightened the straps, and started walking. The first few hours were easy, almost serene. Birds called to each other from the treetops. The crunch of my boots on the gravel and fallen leaves was steady and comforting, and the smell of damp earth mixed with pine was intoxicating. I passed small clearings, old abandoned campsites, and the occasional fallen tree. The forest felt alive but safe, like it was watching me but not yet concerned. By midday, the sun was high, and I found a stream. I stopped to refill my water bottle and eat a small snack. The water was icy cold and clean. I watched minnows dart between rocks and leaves, enjoying the absolute quiet that existed far from any road. Around this point, I veered off the main trail. I wanted to find a more secluded spot for the night, away from the scattered hikers who sometimes passed through. I had a map and a compass, and I felt confident in navigating by them. The trees grew denser, the underbrush thicker, and the trail less distinct. Every step required care. Hidden roots and rocks threatened to trip me. My senses sharpened, each rustle in the leaves or snap of a twig immediately drawing my attention. Around mid-afternoon, I found what seemed like a perfect clearing. A flat area next to a small rise, partially shielded from the wind by a wall of trees, and close enough to a small stream for water. I unpacked my tent, setting it up in the middle of the clearing. I cleared the ground of stones and sticks, laid down my sleeping bag, and then started gathering firewood. I cut small branches with my knife and stacked them in a pyramid shape. The sun was lowering slowly, casting long shadows through the forest. The quiet was absolute, interrupted only by the faint sound of flowing water. I felt a sense of satisfaction at the effort it took to prepare my spot. As the sun dipped behind the hills, the forest darkened quickly. Shadows grew long, and the light that filtered through the trees took on an almost golden hue. I built a small fire and cooked my dinner, a simple meal of dehydrated pasta. The flames crackled and spat sparks, the smell of burning wood mixing with the scent of the forest. I sat on a rock, eating slowly, letting the calm of the evening settle into my chest. The light from the fire illuminated the clearing in a warm, flickering glow. Beyond that circle of light, the forest was thick and dark, a solid wall of black. It was after I had finished eating that the feeling of unease began. At first, it was subtle, a twig snapping too sharply, a rustle in the brush that didn't belong to the wind. I told myself it was a deer or some small animal, but the sound was different. It was deliberate, something moving with purpose. I strained my eyes into the darkness beyond the firelight. I couldn't see anything, but I could hear the soft crunch of leaves, almost like someone or something was circling my camp. My heart began to beat faster. I told myself again that it was an animal, that nothing could hurt me here, that I was alert and prepared. I sat very still, listening. The rustling stopped for a moment, then started again, closer this time. I noticed other details. The smell of wet fur, musky and strong. I knew from my research that bears were common here, and the thought made me tense. I looked around, scanning for movement. The firelight only reached a few feet beyond the clearing. I could see nothing, but the sounds persisted. A snap here, a rustle there, almost synchronized with my own breathing. I decided to stay calm. I knew making sudden movements could provoke an animal if it was close. I grabbed my knife and kept it ready, while also preparing mentally for the possibility of having to defend myself. Then I noticed another sound, more subtle, a soft thump, as if heavy boots or paws were pressing against the ground. This didn't match the light, quick sounds of a deer or fox. My stomach nodded. I spent the next hour sitting by the fire, keeping my ears and eyes sharp. The movements in the underbrush didn't stop, and the sounds of something walking around my perimeter seemed to grow louder and more deliberate. I kept the fire burning high, adding more sticks, trying to create as much light and noise as possible. Despite this, a deep unease settled in my chest. This was no ordinary animal. Then, I heard the sound that made my blood run cold. A low, human-like groan, muffled but distinct, coming from the tree line just beyond the firelight. I froze, barely breathing. My mind raced through every possible scenario. A lost hiker? Someone hurt? Or worse, I scanned the darkness but could see nothing. My instincts screamed to run, but I knew that in darkness, in the middle of the forest, running could be far more dangerous. I remembered my flashlight. Slowly, I lifted it and swept the beam across the clearing and the edge of the forest. The beam caught the outline of something moving. I saw the dark shape of a man, hunched, moving slowly from tree to tree. He didn't rush, didn't call, but he moved with a predatory patience. My pulse skyrocketed. My first thought was to stay calm and evaluate. There was no road nearby, no signs of civilization, and my camp was isolated. I realized I could be in real danger. I didn't panic, but I felt my muscles tighten, preparing for action. I remembered advice I had read about wilderness survival. Do not confront an unknown human alone. Try to stay inside a secure area. Make yourself as visible and threatening as possible. I started adding logs to the fire, making it larger and brighter, waving my flashlight to create movement. The figure hesitated, ducking behind trees, watching. Minutes passed, maybe half an hour. Each sound of movement made my heart pound. My mind worked frantically, thinking of ways to escape or defend myself. I considered packing up quietly and leaving in the dark, but that could trigger a confrontation. I thought about trying to climb a tree, but the surrounding brush made it risky, and I knew that if he approached, I could easily be overpowered. Then I remembered the small stream. I had noticed a narrow path along it a few hours earlier, just barely visible. I decided that my best chance was to move quietly, as soon as he distracted himself, and make for the path. I waited, crouched low, silent, every nerve alert. The figure started moving in the opposite direction, away from the firelight, perhaps trying to avoid detection. My chance came. I grabbed my pack, slipped into the shadows, and moved toward the path. My boots made barely a sound. The forest seemed impossibly dark, even with my headlamp on, and every step brought a risk of snapping a branch. I reached the narrow path and moved as quickly and quietly as I could. My heart was still hammering, and my ears strained for any sign that I had been noticed. The man was no longer in sight, but I didn't dare assume I was safe. I followed the path along the stream, using it as a guide, hoping it would lead me back to the main trail. The ground was uneven, the water rushing over rocks and logs. I stumbled a few times but caught myself, every step heightening my awareness of the forest sounds. After what felt like hours but was probably only an hour, I finally reached the main trail. Relief washed over me, but I stayed alert, keeping an eye and ear out for any movement. I walked briskly but carefully, following the trail toward where I had left my car. Every shadow and noise made my stomach knot, but I kept moving. By the time I reached the trailhead, the first light of dawn was breaking through the trees. My car was exactly where I had left it, and thankfully, there was no sign of the man. I locked the doors and sat inside for a long time, breathing heavily, trying to calm myself. I didn't sleep that night, driving back home as soon as it was light enough to see clearly. The experience left me shaken. I realized how vulnerable I had been, how quickly a peaceful wilderness trip could turn into a situation where I had no control. The memory of those dark, purposeful movements in the forest, the groan, and the feeling of being watched would stay with me for a long time. But I also felt a sense of accomplishment. I had stayed calm, assessed the situation, and escaped without confrontation. My knowledge, preparation, and patience had kept me safe. The story ended there, with me back in civilization, safe and unharmed, and the forest still waiting in quiet darkness for the next unsuspecting traveler. I never returned to that spot, but I carried the lessons of that night forever. The wilderness is beautiful, but it is also unpredictable, and sometimes the real danger isn't the animals or the terrain. It is another human being, patient, silent, and watching. I had been planning this solo camping trip for months, mapping out a remote section of the national forest that few people ever visited. The idea was simple: disconnect from the world, breathe the clean air, and be completely alone in the wild. I packed carefully, making sure I had the essentials: tent, sleeping bag, stove, enough food for a week, water purification tablets, first aid kit, a map, and a compass. I had done this before, but this time I wanted more solitude, more raw experience. I wanted the wilderness to be the only thing I felt, to measure myself against it and see what I could endure. The drive-in was long and quiet. The road wound through towering pine trees that stretched like sentinels along either side, shadows thick and dark even in the late afternoon. I passed a few scattered cabins, old and weathered, most appearing abandoned. I told myself not to worry about them. By the time I reached the forest's edge, the sun was low, casting long orange streaks across the forest floor. I parked, grabbed my pack, and started down the narrow trail. The path was overgrown, and the silence was absolute. There were no birds, no rustle of squirrels, just the occasional creak of a tree in the wind. I kept walking, pushing the nagging feeling of being watched to the back of my mind. I chose a campsite near a small stream I could hear before I saw it. The sound of running water was soothing, a promise of hydration and cleanliness. I set up my tent in a small clearing surrounded by pines and thick underbrush. I was meticulous, staking down the tent, organizing my gear, and inspecting the area for anything that might cause problems. I made a fire pit from rocks, collected kindling, and lit a small fire. The flames flickered, casting shadows that danced across the trees. At first, the isolation felt peaceful, almost meditative. I cooked a simple meal, roasted some vegetables, and ate slowly, savoring the taste and quiet. The sun dipped behind the trees, leaving the forest in a dim twilight that gradually turned to deep night. As darkness fell, the forest became a different place. The rustle of small animals in the underbrush sounded louder. Every crack of a branch, every shift of leaves made me tense. I reminded myself that I was prepared and capable, that animals in this forest were more afraid of me than I was of them. Still, a subtle unease settled over me, an instinctive awareness that I was completely alone, without immediate help, in a place that could become dangerous very quickly. Around midnight, I woke to a sound that made my stomach tighten. It was faint at first, almost indistinguishable, a low, rhythmic crunching in the underbrush near the edge of my clearing. I froze, straining to listen. The sound grew slightly, slow but deliberate, not the erratic movement of small wildlife. I reached for my flashlight, trying not to make sudden movements. I switched it on and swept it toward the noise, the narrow beam cutting through the darkness. The trees remained still, shadows unbroken, but the sound persisted, like something heavy was moving through the forest just beyond the light. My heart rate increased. I told myself it was probably a deer or a large raccoon, but the cadence of the steps didn't match anything I had ever heard. There was purpose behind them, weight and consistency. I debated leaving the tent to investigate, but reminded myself of safety rules. Never wander in the dark alone if you're not sure what's out there. I stayed still, keeping the flashlight ready and listening. The sound circled my campsite slowly, always just outside the radius of light. I could hear twigs snapping under something heavy. Then I realized the steps weren't random. They were deliberate, circling closer and farther in a pattern that was almost like someone or something was tracking me, testing me. The rational part of my brain tried to tell me it was likely an animal, maybe a black bear, which were common in this area, but there was something in the sound that didn't feel animal. Bears moved differently, noisier, more chaotic. This movement had control. I remembered the pepper spray in my pack, and slowly, without making sudden moves, I reached for it. I also grabbed a heavy hiking pole I had brought, ready to defend myself. The sounds grew louder, closer, and then stopped. Absolute silence fell for a moment, the kind of silence that makes every hair on your body stand on end. Then, suddenly, a loud rustling came from the direction of my firewood pile. I shone the flashlight directly at it. There, partially illuminated by the firelight, was a figure crouched low to the ground. My first instinct was disbelief, then fear gripped me like a vice. It was a human, dressed in dark, nondescript clothing, partially obscured by shadows. I couldn't see a face, but the figure was definitely watching me. My mind raced. How had someone gotten this far into the forest without leaving tracks on the trail? How long had they been following me? I remembered reading about people who attacked campers in remote areas, people who watched, studied, and then struck when they had the advantage. I gripped the pole tightly, trying to make myself seem larger and more imposing, and in a controlled voice I told myself to stay calm, stay rational, do not panic. The figure didn't move. It stayed crouched near my firewood, motionless. I felt trapped. My mind weighed options. Run to my car, grab my things, climb a tree, try to make noise to scare the intruder off. I decided the safest immediate option was to keep them visible and maintain the firelight, which acted as both a barrier and a spotlight. Slowly, I inched toward the figure, shining the flashlight directly on it. They stood up suddenly, tall, with a backpack, and started moving away from the clearing. My first instinct was relief. They weren't attacking, at least not yet. But that relief was tempered by realization. They had been close enough to observe me while I was asleep, and now they were retreating only because I saw them. I wasn't safe. I grabbed my pack and stove, stuffed essential items in a smaller backpack, and prepared to leave immediately. I had left my car parked a mile down the trail, but in the dark, I couldn't just run blindly. I needed to plan. I took a deep breath and turned off the fire, extinguishing the flames completely. Every shadow became a potential threat. I waited for another sound, anything that would indicate the figure had noticed me leaving. When nothing came, I started toward the trail, moving quietly but as quickly as possible. My flashlight beam bobbed across the forest floor, illuminating roots and fallen branches. Every snap underfoot made my heart pound. As I hiked, I noticed signs that the figure had been following me on the trail. Broken twigs, disturbed leaves, a faint outline of a footprint in soft mud. I tried to mask my scent and sound, ducking behind trees and moving erratically, hoping to confuse anyone tracking me. My thoughts raced. If they caught me here, there was no one for miles to help. I pictured the car, the keys, the ability to get out of the forest. That became my single focus. I moved faster, taking calculated risks, jumping over small logs, sliding down embankments, crawling under branches. The night was unforgiving, thick with the smell of wet pine and dirt. Hours passed, though it felt like minutes, and I kept moving. Eventually, I reached a narrow ridge above the stream where I had camped. I paused to catch my breath, scanning the area below and behind me. No movement. The forest was silent, as if it had swallowed everything. My mind tried to process what had happened, how someone had followed me, why, and for how long. I realized I had been lucky. The intruder might have been deterred by my preparedness, my awareness, or maybe they had their own reasons for retreating. I didn't stop to think about that too long. My survival instincts demanded action. By the first light of dawn, I was back at the main trail. I kept moving until I reached a small ranger station. The building was empty, but I left a detailed note describing what had happened, including the time, location, and description of the figure. I filled a water bottle and rested briefly, my body exhausted, mind on high alert. I decided not to go back into the forest for the remainder of the trip. The isolation I had sought suddenly felt like a trap I barely escaped. I drove back to the nearest town, stopping only when I felt safe on roads that were clear and populated. I reported the incident to the local authorities, who took my statement seriously, noting that people had been seen illegally camping and hiking in remote areas for various reasons, some dangerous. I stayed in a motel that night, sleeping with the lights on, every sound outside keeping me on edge. My sense of vulnerability was intense, but I also felt a deep satisfaction. I had navigated the situation, protected myself, and made it out without harm. The forest remained wild and intimidating, but I had survived it. In the weeks that followed, I avoided solo camping in that area, but I didn't stop camping altogether. I realized that preparation, awareness, and calmness under pressure were what mattered most. The experience taught me about my limits, my instincts, and the very real dangers that can exist in places where you assume you are alone. I invested in better safety equipment, mapped safer areas, and even learned advanced tracking signs to recognize if someone was nearby. The fear didn't leave completely, but it became a tool, a reminder to respect the wilderness and its unpredictability, and to never underestimate the presence of others, even where you think you are completely alone. I had always enjoyed the solitude of the outdoors. There was something about being away from cities, away from the constant hum of people and traffic, that made the world feel simpler and calmer. I spent a lot of weekends camping alone, preferring the quiet over company, and I had grown careful and self-reliant over the years. I liked to pick remote spots where cell service was weak and where I would be truly on my own. On this particular trip, I chose a small clearing deep in the woods of a national forest, about an hour's hike from the nearest trailhead. It wasn't a well-known spot. In fact, I had stumbled across it last summer while scouting new areas. The clearing was flat and surrounded by thick pines and oaks. A narrow stream ran along one edge, its water cold and clear, tumbling over small stones in a constant, soothing rhythm. The ground was soft with fallen leaves, pine needles, and moss, and I felt confident that it would be perfect for setting up a tent and spending a few nights alone. I arrived in the late afternoon, when the sun was still warm but starting its slow descent behind the trees. I carried a small backpack with basic gear: a tent, sleeping bag, food for 3 days, water filter, a first aid kit, a flashlight, a headlamp, and a small folding saw I used to gather firewood. I also had a compact emergency kit with a whistle, fire starter, extra batteries, and a small knife. I had learned the hard way to always prepare for more than I thought I might need. I had been camping long enough to know that being caught unprepared in the woods could be dangerous in ways that weren't immediately obvious. I set up my tent in the clearing, taking care to clear the ground of any sticks or rocks that might poke through my sleeping pad. I staked the corners firmly, made sure the rainfly was tight, and arranged my sleeping area neatly. Then I gathered some dry wood from the surrounding trees, careful to break off only fallen branches, leaving the living trees untouched. The forest was quiet in the late afternoon, only the occasional bird calling, the rustle of squirrels or chipmunks in the underbrush, and the soft sound of the stream nearby. I set up a small fire pit in a circle of stones I found scattered on the ground. Nothing about the spot looked dangerous. It felt familiar, comfortable, the kind of place I would have happily spent many nights before. I built a modest fire, small but steady, enough to give me warmth as the temperature dropped, and to cook my dinner. I had some instant rice and beans in my pack, along with a few cans of tuna and some trail mix. I boiled water over the flames, carefully keeping the fire contained, and ate my meal slowly, savoring the quiet and the smell of smoke and pine. The sun dipped lower, and the shadows of the trees grew long and dark, spreading across the clearing. As night fell, I put out the fire, leaving a small layer of glowing embers in case I needed it again later. I always followed proper fire safety, so I made sure to have a bucket of water and loose dirt nearby to fully extinguish it. I crawled into my sleeping bag, listening to the gentle murmur of the stream and the occasional crack of a falling branch. It was peaceful, more peaceful than any city apartment could ever be. I felt secure, even though I was completely alone. Around midnight, I woke to a subtle noise. At first, I thought it was an animal, probably a raccoon or a deer, but then I realized the sound was coming from the stream. It wasn't the usual gentle gurgle I had heard before. It was sharper, a sudden splash, like something falling into the water. I froze, listening carefully. The forest was otherwise silent. The wind had died down, the usual nocturnal sounds seemed muted, and that splash echoed in the stillness. I stayed in my sleeping bag, trying to calm my racing thoughts. Maybe it was a branch falling into the water. Maybe a deer had stepped in the stream. Then I heard it again. A wet, heavy splash, closer this time, and followed by a dragging sound, like something large being pulled along the ground. I sat up slowly, trying to see in the darkness. I had a small flashlight clipped to the front of my pack, so I switched it on, shining the beam toward the stream. Nothing. The light caught only the edges of the trees and the glint of the water. The dragging sound stopped. I froze, every sense alert, my heart thumping in my chest. I tried to rationalize it. I was deep in the forest. There were predators, sure, but the likelihood of encountering a bear or a cougar here at this hour was low. I told myself it was probably a deer that had fallen into the water or some other harmless animal. Still, the noise had felt deliberate, too heavy to be a normal animal movement. I lay back down but couldn't sleep. I kept my flashlight in my hand, resting on my chest, and I listened. The night was dense and oppressive in its silence, broken only by the distant hoot of an owl or the crackle of a falling pine needle. Hours seemed to pass like this, each minute stretching endlessly. At one point, I heard something different, a faint rustling, like someone walking through leaves. I held my breath. The sound moved closer, careful, deliberate, like someone was stepping cautiously through the forest. My mind raced. I had read about people who went missing in national parks, attacked or lost after venturing off trails. I had always assumed it wouldn't happen to me, but now I realized how wrong that assumption was. I didn't make a sound. I thought about the small survival knife in my pack and the bear spray I kept in the side pocket. I didn't want to confront whatever it was, but I needed to be ready if it approached my tent. I waited, heart hammering, and then I heard it. The faintest sound of a stick snapping underfoot, not far from the edge of my fire pit. Whoever or whatever it was here. I realized my best chance was to wait and see if it left. I didn't move, didn't shine the light in its direction, just listened. And then I noticed something I hadn't before. Footprints. Fresh footprints in the soft soil around the clearing. They were large, human-like, and messy, like someone had stumbled or walked carefully in an attempt to make little noise. My stomach sank. Someone had been near my tent, watching, maybe even waiting. The thought made the hair on my arms stand up. I decided to stay quiet until dawn. I spent the rest of the night in a state of tense alertness, listening for any movement, readying myself to react if necessary. The hours dragged, and every little noise made my heart leap. Eventually, the first light of dawn began to filter through the trees, faint and gray. I waited until full daylight, then cautiously unzipped my tent. The clearing looked normal at first glance. Nothing had been disturbed inside the tent, but the footprints were still there, leading from the edge of the woods to the stream and then back toward the trees. I followed them with my eyes, noting the direction they came from. They were fresh, and there were at least 2 sets. Whoever had been here was careful but not experienced, stepping lightly over sticks, avoiding the mud, but their pattern was uneven, like they had been nervous. I knew I couldn't stay. I packed up everything as quickly and quietly as possible, keeping my knife and bear spray close. I didn't want to make noise that might attract whoever had been there. I moved slowly through the woods, keeping the sun at my back so my shadow wouldn't be visible in the clearing, following the trail back to the main path I had used to enter. I didn't stop, didn't rest, not even when I was tired or thirsty. The sense of being watched never left me. Every rustle in the leaves, every snapping branch made me jump. I realized later that I hadn't heard any other animals all night. It was as though the forest itself had gone quiet. By mid-morning, I reached the trailhead. I saw cars parked along the small dirt lot, and I felt an immense wave of relief. I was no longer alone, no longer in that clearing. I got into my car, locked the doors, and drove away without looking back. I didn't return to that area for years, and when I did, I checked the clearing from a distance and found no sign of human activity. I never learned who had been there that night or why. Could have been a group of thieves, hunters, or something else entirely, but I realized that being alone in the forest, even in a place that feels safe, comes with risks I had underestimated. The experience changed the way I approached camping. I continued to go into remote areas, but I started to take extra precautions. I made sure someone always knew where I was. I carried extra tools, and I paid more attention to the environment, tracking changes in the forest around me. I learned to respect the unknown presence that could exist even in familiar woods. Years later, I returned to the same national forest, but never to that clearing. I found new spots, new streams, new quiet glades, and I carried the memory of that night with me. It reminded me that the outdoors, while beautiful and peaceful, could also be unpredictable and dangerous, and that preparation, caution, and awareness were the only things that could ensure safety. Even now, when I pack for a camping trip, I double-check my gear, study the area, and keep my senses sharp. I never take solitude for granted, and although I have had many quiet nights alone in the forest since, I never again experienced that same sinking feeling of being watched, of knowing someone was near but unseen. That night remains etched in my memory, a lesson in vigilance, survival, and the thin line between peace and danger in the wilderness. I had always liked camping alone. There was something about being out in the wild, away from the noise of people, cars, and the constant hum of electricity, that made me feel alive in a way nothing else could. It was not about escaping my life, exactly, but more about confronting it in a quiet way. That summer, I decided to explore a forest area that was known but rarely traveled. The map showed trails that wound through dense woodland and along a river that cut deep into the terrain. People spoke of the forest as beautiful, remote, and challenging. That combination was exactly what I wanted. I packed my gear meticulously. My backpack was heavy, but I had everything I thought I might need. Tent, sleeping bag, cooking equipment, food for 5 days, extra clothes, a first aid kit, flashlight, and a small hatchet. I had also taken extra batteries, a portable water filter, and a map with a compass, even though my phone had GPS redundancy mattered when you were alone in the wilderness. I had done long hikes and multi-day camping trips before, but this one felt different. The forest was deeper, wilder, and less trafficked. The first day started easily enough. The trail was steep in parts, but the sunlight filtering through the trees made the path feel alive. Birds called occasionally, and the air smelled of pine, earth, and moss. I moved steadily, taking regular breaks to drink water and check the map. I passed a small creek, its water cold and clear, reflecting the sun in little shards. I stopped there to fill my bottle and rest for a while, feeling a sense of quiet satisfaction that the day had begun well. As the afternoon passed, the forest began to thicken. The trees were closer together, their trunks wide and twisted, and the undergrowth became denser. I noticed fallen branches, moss-covered rocks, and the occasional broken tree trunk that hinted at the power of storms that had swept through before. Birds and small animals grew scarce, replaced by a heavy silence that pressed around me. I had anticipated this, but it still made me aware of how alone I was. I reached the campsite I had chosen near a bend in the river just as the sun began to dip. The spot was small but flat, with enough space for my tent and a fire pit. I started setting up my gear, checking everything twice. I collected wood for a fire, some damp but usable branches, and arranged them carefully. I had learned over the years that fire was not just warmth and light, it was security. That night, after eating a small meal of canned beans and bread, I settled into my tent. The forest around me was alive with nocturnal sounds. Crickets, frogs, and distant bird calls formed a chorus that was oddly soothing. I lay on my sleeping bag and listened for a long time, feeling my heartbeat slow, feeling comfortable, knowing I was prepared for this. Sleep came eventually, but not immediately. I kept my flashlight within reach and the hatchet close, just in case. I woke in the early hours to a sound that immediately made my stomach tighten. There was rustling, subtle at first, then louder, closer. I froze, listening. My mind raced through possibilities. A deer, a raccoon, a bear, a person. The forest could be home to all of them. I slipped out of my sleeping bag, taking my flashlight, and slowly unzipped the tent. The beam of light cut through the darkness, illuminating a section of the clearing. There was movement, a large shadow moving between the trees, too large and heavy for a deer, too fluid for a human. My pulse spiked, but I stayed calm. I remembered all the advice I had read about encounters with wild animals. Bears were a possibility in this region. They usually avoided humans, but they could be curious or desperate for food. I didn't panic. I checked my food storage. Everything was secured in my backpack, which I had hung from a tree with a rope. Nothing was loose. I made noise by clapping and stomping lightly to signal my presence. The rustling stopped, but I didn't see the animal. I stayed awake until dawn, fully alert, listening to every sound. When the sun rose, the forest looked less threatening but still intense. The tracks around my campsite confirmed my fears. Large paw prints leading up to the edge of the clearing and then away, leaving a sense of lingering danger. I ate breakfast cautiously, keeping my movements slow and deliberate. I decided not to leave the tent unless necessary. The next day, I broke camp early. I wanted to avoid being caught in a confined spot at night again. The trail was harder than I expected. Muddy sections slowed me down, and fallen logs forced me to climb awkwardly. Every sound in the forest now made me tense. Every snapping branch or rustle a potential threat. I relied heavily on my compass and map because GPS was unreliable under the dense canopy. The further I went, the less traveled the path became, until it seemed almost as if I was moving through a part of the world untouched by people. As afternoon came, I decided to cross the river to follow a ridge that promised a better view and safer camping spot. The river was fast, swollen from recent rain, and the rocks slippery. I tested each step carefully, my backpack heavy on my shoulders. Halfway across, one of the rocks shifted beneath my foot. I lost my balance, barely catching myself, but water splashed over my boots and soaked my socks. My heart pounded, but I forced myself to continue, knowing panic would only make things worse. I reached the other side, wet but safe, and found a small ledge above the river that seemed suitable for a temporary rest. While sitting there, drying off, I noticed something alarming. A pair of eyes reflected briefly in the water downstream, moving swiftly along the riverbank. It was hard to tell what it was at first. A large animal, certainly, but the shape seemed humanoid, low and crouched. My imagination raced, but I forced myself to analyze rationally. Could be a bear that had followed me from the previous night. Bears were known to move along rivers for food. I packed up quickly, moving further inland and away from the riverbank, keeping my movements deliberate and calm. I hiked until late afternoon before finding a narrow clearing where I could set up camp again. The ground was uneven, with small stones, but I managed. I built a fire cautiously, stacking rocks to contain it, and kept a sharp eye on the surrounding trees. That night, sleep was almost impossible. Every sound made me startle. The cracking of branches, rustling of leaves, the wind. I sat for hours, fire crackling, heart beating fast. At one point, I heard heavy footsteps circling the edge of the clearing. My flashlight revealed nothing, but the impressions in the dirt confirmed I was not alone. By morning, exhaustion was overwhelming. I had little energy left, but I knew I had to continue hiking out. The forest was no longer just beautiful. It had become threatening, indifferent to my presence, testing my resolve. I packed my tent, leaving nothing behind, and focused entirely on reaching the main trail marked on my map. Every step was careful. I avoided unnecessary breaks and kept my ears and eyes alert for any unusual signs. Midday, I stumbled across a small abandoned ranger station. It was a tiny wooden hut, falling apart in places, with tools scattered and old cans of food rusting in the corners. I checked it quickly for supplies. Nothing usable, but it offered a moment of shelter and a chance to rest off the trail. I ate a small snack and drank water, trying not to linger too long. The forest around the hut was quiet, almost eerily so, as if it was holding its breath. I felt relief mixed with an underlying tension, knowing that leaving would still be risky. I continued hiking along the ridge as planned. The terrain was steep, with loose soil, rocks, and thick underbrush, but the higher ground offered visibility, which made me feel safer. From this vantage point, I could see where the river cut through the forest below, winding like a snake. I realized I had underestimated the scale of the forest, the vastness of it, and how quickly one could become lost or trapped. My pace slowed as fatigue set in, but my attention remained sharp. By late afternoon, I finally reached a section of trail that was clearly marked and more regularly traveled. The relief I felt was immense. I knew that once I followed this trail, I would encounter other hikers or possibly a ranger station with communication options. Every step along this familiar path felt lighter, less fraught with danger. I still moved cautiously, aware of the forest behind me, but the sense of imminent threat had diminished. Around early evening, I emerged from the dense forest onto a gravel path that led to a small parking area. A couple of cars were parked there, and distant voices told me that civilization was near. I felt an enormous wave of relief. My legs were stiff, my clothes dirty and torn in places, my backpack battered, but I had made it out. I paused to stretch and breathe deeply, taking in the fresh air that smelled less like wet earth and more like the edge of town. I reported my location to a ranger I found nearby, describing my route and the areas where I had seen the signs of large animals. They were concerned, noting that the region had bears known to approach campsites if food was improperly stored. I realized how close I had come to serious danger. The ranger advised leaving the forest earlier than planned and taking more precautions in the future. I listened carefully, feeling a combination of gratitude, exhaustion, and a new respect for the wilderness. By the time I returned to my car and began the drive back home, the sun was setting, painting the sky in orange and purple streaks. My mind replayed every detail of the trip: the rustling at night, the paw prints, the river crossing, the ridge climb, the abandoned hut. Each moment had tested me physically and mentally. I felt a profound sense of achievement and relief. I had faced danger, navigated the wilderness alone, and survived without incident beyond the natural challenges of the forest. The experience left a lasting impression. I knew I would camp again, but never without even more careful planning. I realized the forest was not a place to conquer. It was a place to respect, to move through cautiously, and to be aware that even small mistakes could escalate quickly. That trip stayed with me for years. The quiet fear of night, the adrenaline of close calls, the satisfaction of overcoming obstacles, and the clarity of finally returning safely. It was a reminder that nature was beautiful, but it demanded attention, patience, and humility. I never saw the animal that had circled my second campsite again, and I never wanted to. The mystery remained, a silent testament to the wildness I had encountered. I returned home physically intact, mentally sharp, and with a story that I could remember vividly, a story of fear, endurance, and survival. That trip changed the way I viewed the wilderness. It taught me that respect, preparation, and caution were the real tools for safety, not luck or bravery alone. And when I finally unpacked my gear and cleaned my clothes, I felt a quiet pride in knowing I had tested my limits and returned stronger and wiser for it. I never considered myself the type to get scared easily. I had grown up camping in the forests near my hometown, and I thought I knew the woods well enough to handle anything. The smell of pine needles underfoot, the rustle of leaves in the wind, and the occasional distant call of a wild animal had always felt comforting, familiar. But what happened on that trip would change my sense of confidence in ways I could never have imagined. I had planned the trip for weeks, carefully choosing a spot far away from the main campgrounds, a secluded area near a small, rarely visited lake tucked deep into the forest. My goal was simple: get away from everyone and everything, breathe the fresh air, enjoy a few days of solitude, and fish. I packed everything meticulously: a tent, sleeping bag, food for 3 days, water purification tablets, a small first aid kit, a flashlight, matches, and even extra batteries. I double-checked everything because I had learned early that being careless in the wild could get you into serious trouble. I drove for hours on the winding forest road, past signs of civilization that gradually faded into just trees and gravel. By the time I reached the spot I had scouted on my map, the sun was already halfway down, casting long shadows through the tall pines. The lake itself was quiet, the water still and dark, reflecting the sky like glass. I parked my car on the narrow path I had found, stepped out, and inhaled the crisp, cool air. For a moment, everything felt perfect. I set up my tent on a small clearing just a short distance from the lake's edge. The ground was soft with fallen pine needles, and I made sure to secure the tent stakes firmly. I organized my camping gear inside, laid out my sleeping bag, and arranged my backpack with the food and supplies I would need. By the time I had everything ready, the sun had dipped below the horizon, leaving a faint glow on the water. The woods were settling into darkness, and the world was suddenly quiet, except for the soft rustle of leaves in the evening breeze. I lit a small campfire near the edge of the clearing, careful to keep it contained, and sat on a fallen log to eat my dinner. The crackling of the fire and the smell of smoke mingled with the pine scent in a way that always felt grounding. As night fully fell, I could hear the subtle, distant sounds of the forest. An owl calling somewhere deep in the trees, the occasional splash of a fish jumping in the lake, and the soft scurry of small animals in the underbrush. These were sounds I knew well and had always found comforting. I lay in my sleeping bag early, as I wanted to get up before sunrise to try fishing. The night was cold, colder than I had expected, and I pulled the sleeping bag tightly around me. I thought about how peaceful it was here, so isolated, and how rare it was to find such a quiet place away from people and noise. Sleep came slowly but eventually, and I dozed off to the rhythmic sounds of the forest. Sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up. It was dark, darker than I had expected, almost as if the forest had swallowed all the light. The fire I had left smoldering had died down, leaving only glowing embers. At first, I thought it was just the usual night noises keeping me awake, but then I heard something different, a rustling, faint but deliberate, coming from the direction of the lake. I froze, listening. It wasn't the usual sound of small animals. It was heavier, deliberate, like something or someone was moving slowly but with purpose. My heart started to race, and I felt a cold sweat form on my forehead. I tried to tell myself it was probably just a deer or a raccoon, something that had caught my scent or my firelight. But then I heard a splash, soft at first, then louder, as if something had stepped into the shallow water near the shore. My stomach twisted. No deer or raccoon would step into the water so deliberately and stay still. My mind raced, trying to make sense of it. I had no signal on my phone. The area was too remote. Panic started to creep in. I considered packing up and leaving immediately, but I also knew that moving around in the dark, unprepared, could be just as dangerous. I slowly unzipped the tent just a crack and peeked outside. The moonlight was thin, barely lighting the lake. I strained my eyes, trying to see anything, but it was almost impossible. All I could hear was the soft splash and the occasional snap of a twig. I gripped my flashlight tightly, debating whether to turn it on. I knew turning it on could give away my position if there was someone or something watching. My mind was spinning with possibilities, each one worse than the last. Minutes passed, or maybe hours, I couldn't tell. The forest seemed to stretch endlessly in all directions, and every sound was amplified in the quiet. Then, I heard a low thump from behind my tent, near where I had stacked my gear. I froze again, holding my breath, listening. Something was moving closer. The thumps became more regular, heavier, and deliberate. My body trembled, and my mind raced. I was alone, miles from anyone, and suddenly I felt the terrifying vulnerability of that isolation. I tried to tell myself it was probably just a deer or a raccoon, something that had caught my scent or my firelight. But then I heard a splash, soft at first, then louder, as if something had stepped into the shallow water near the shore. My stomach twisted. No deer or raccoon would step into the water so deliberately and stay still. My mind raced, trying to make sense of it. I had no signal on my phone. The area was too remote. Panic started to creep in. I considered packing up and leaving immediately, but I also knew that moving around in the dark, unprepared, could be just as dangerous. I slowly unzipped the tent just a crack and peeked outside. The moonlight was thin, barely lighting the lake. I strained my eyes, trying to see anything, but it was almost impossible. All I could hear was the soft splash and the occasional snap of a twig. I gripped my flashlight tightly, debating whether to turn it on. I knew turning it on could give away my position if there was someone or something watching. My mind was spinning with possibilities, each one worse than the last. Minutes passed, or maybe hours, I couldn't tell. The forest seemed to stretch endlessly in all directions, and every sound was amplified in the quiet. Then, I heard a low thump from behind my tent, near where I had stacked my gear. I froze again, holding my breath, listening. Something was moving closer. The thumps became more regular, heavier, and deliberate. My body trembled, and my mind raced. I was alone, miles from anyone, and suddenly I felt the terrifying vulnerability of that isolation. I tried to think rationally. There were no lights, no sounds of voices, so it wasn't another camper. Could it be an animal? Bears were possible in this area. I had stored my food securely, but I had some snacks in my tent. Bears could smell that from a distance, but the movement didn't match what I knew about wildlife. It was too quiet, too careful, and too deliberate. It felt human. My pulse pounded, and I realized I had to make a choice. I could either stay inside the tent and hope for the best, or I could try to get my gear and leave, risking a confrontation. I decided to stay inside for the moment, hoping the intruder, if it was human, would go away. I kept my flashlight close, my hand resting on my pocket knife. The thumping slowed, then stopped. Silence returned, but it was worse than the noise because now my imagination ran wild. I listened for breathing, for any sound of movement. Hours seemed to stretch like days. Eventually, exhaustion overtook the fear slightly, and I drifted into an uneasy sleep, keeping my knife within reach. I woke again before dawn. The sky was turning pale, and the forest looked less threatening in the early light. The first thing I did was check my gear. My backpack was intact, my tent was undisturbed, but I noticed small footprints around the clearing. They were human. Someone had been there during the night. The realization hit me like a punch. I was not alone, and someone had been moving around my camp while I slept. My hands shook as I traced the prints. They were large, heavy, and barefoot. I had never seen prints like that before, and the idea that someone could approach me silently in the woods terrified me. I made a quick decision. I packed everything carefully but quickly. I didn't want to leave anything behind. I folded the sleeping bag, stuffed the food and water into my backpack, and collapsed the tent. Every sound made me jump. A bird taking off, a branch snapping under its own weight. The forest seemed alive with hidden eyes watching. Once everything was packed, I didn't take a chance on walking back the same path I had come. I decided to move along the edge of the lake, keeping to the trees, hoping to find a road or at least a more visible path. As I moved, I realized how easy it would have been for someone to hide and watch me, to plan something. Every rustle, every shadow seemed threatening. My heart pounded in my chest. I kept my flashlight ready, and my knife tucked into my hand. I made slow, deliberate movements, trying to stay quiet but also alert. The lake, once beautiful and serene, now felt like a mirror reflecting the fear in my mind. Hours passed. I stayed on high alert, watching every movement in the forest, jumping at every sound. Eventually, the terrain changed, and I found a faint trail. I followed it carefully, still alert, hoping it would lead to a road or another hiker. By mid-morning, I finally reached a wider trail that I recognized from a map I had studied earlier. Relief washed over me, but I didn't let my guard down. I kept moving, checking the surroundings until finally, I saw the road. My car was still there, exactly where I had left it. I ran the last stretch, my legs shaking, my mind still racing from the terror of the night. I locked the car doors and drove straight out of the forest. I didn't stop until I reached the nearest town. I reported what happened to the local authorities, and they came to check the area, but by the time they arrived, there was no sign of anyone else. The footprints were gone, and there was no evidence of intrusion beyond the ones I had seen. They warned me that this part of the forest was known for trespassers and that people had occasionally targeted isolated campers, but they had no leads on who or what had been there. Even weeks later, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, the memory of those silent footsteps outside my tent, the deliberate splashes in the lake, and the shadowy presence that had kept me frozen in fear. I learned that fear in the wilderness is not about ghosts or legends. It's about the real, tangible danger of being alone and vulnerable. I learned to respect the woods, to prepare even more carefully, and to trust my instincts. I returned home and slowly returned to normal life, but camping would never feel the same again. I started to take more precautions, always letting someone know exactly where I was going, carrying extra safety gear, and never camping completely alone. But I also learned something else. The woods, beautiful as they are unpredictable, and one must always be alert. The real fear comes from the unknown, from the very real possibility that someone or something could be watching, moving silently, waiting. And that knowledge, once experienced, never leaves you. I had planned this camping trip for months, carefully choosing a spot deep in the national forest far from any main roads, where cell service was non-existent and the air smelled clean with the faint, earthy scent of pine needles. I had been hiking and camping for years, but I wanted to challenge myself this time. I wanted isolation and the quiet of the wilderness in its rawest form. The area I chose was known for its dense forest, uneven terrain, and steep inclines, but it also had a small creek that ran year-round. I imagined myself sitting beside that creek at night, watching the water ripple under the moonlight, completely disconnected from the world. I arrived just before sunset. The parking area was small, just enough for a few cars, and it was mostly empty. I grabbed my backpack, which I had packed meticulously. A tent, sleeping bag, extra clothes, food, a first aid kit, matches, a small camping stove, and a flashlight with extra batteries. I double-checked everything as I walked down the narrow trail that would lead me to my intended campsite. The trail wound between massive trees, their roots snaking across the dirt, making every step slightly precarious. Shadows stretched long and twisted as the sun dipped behind the hills, and the forest grew darker with every minute. I felt a mixture of excitement and unease. There was nothing inherently dangerous yet, but I knew that darkness changed everything. After about an hour of hiking, I reached a clearing where the creek curved gently. The ground was uneven but firm, covered in soft moss and small patches of grass. I dropped my backpack and began setting up the tent, taking extra care to choose a flat spot. The creek's gentle babble was soothing, almost hypnotic. Once the tent was secured, I unpacked a few things and built a small fire pit using stones I found nearby. I had brought some firewood, but I also gathered a few dry branches from the forest floor. By the time I had a fire going, it was fully dark. The forest around me was alive with sounds. The rustling of leaves, the distant cry of an owl, the occasional snap of a twig. I felt a small thrill at being completely alone in this environment, relying only on my skills and my preparation. I ate a simple meal of canned beans heated over the fire and some crackers. The warmth of the fire contrasted sharply with the chill that settled in the air as night deepened. I cleaned up, carefully packing away any food scraps to avoid attracting wildlife, and crawled into my sleeping bag. The sounds of the creek and the forest became a lullaby, and I eventually drifted into a light sleep. Sometime during the night, I was awakened by a faint sound. At first, I thought it was just the wind or a branch falling somewhere in the distance. But then I heard it again, a distinct snapping sound, like someone stepping on a twig. My pulse quickened. I lay still, straining to hear over the sound of the creek. There it was again, closer this time. It wasn't the wind. Someone, or something, was moving through the forest near my campsite. My heart raced, but I told myself to stay calm. Could be a deer or some other animal. I kept my flashlight and a small pocket knife within reach and tried to stay quiet. The snapping continued intermittently, circling the clearing. I couldn't see anything through the trees, but the sounds were too deliberate to be random wildlife. Whoever or whatever it was aware of my presence. Hours passed like this. Every sound made me jump. I tried to focus on my breathing and convince myself that it was just an animal. I reminded myself that I had done this many times before, but there was a tension in the air I had never felt in any previous camping trip. The forest, usually a place of peace, felt suffocating. Every time I thought I was falling asleep, a twig would snap or leaves would rustle just beyond the firelight. I could feel eyes on me. I wasn't just alone in the forest. I was being watched. Eventually, the sounds stopped, The forest became eerily silent. I stayed awake, heart pounding, until the first hint of dawn. I could barely sleep, only dozing lightly as the sun rose and the forest slowly brightened. I decided to stay alert and pack up quickly in case whatever had been out there returned. I broke camp as quickly as I could, leaving as little trace as possible. While packing, I noticed something unusual: small footprints in the soft soil around my tent. They weren't animal tracks. They were too human-shaped, with a narrow heel and toes. They led from the forest edge toward my campsite and stopped near my fire pit. My stomach dropped. Whoever had been out there had approached me while I slept. I had been completely unaware. Panic surged through me, but I forced myself to remain calm. I grabbed my backpack, extinguished the fire, and started hiking back toward the trailhead. I made sure to stay alert, scanning the forest continuously. The hike back was tense and slow. Every snapping branch, every rustle of leaves, made me flinch. I stuck to the trail as much as possible, avoiding stepping on dry twigs when I could. Hours passed. My legs ached, and my energy was fading, but the trail was familiar, and I forced myself to keep going. Around mid-morning, I heard voices and the sound of a vehicle engine in the distance. Relief surged through me. I picked up my pace and soon emerged from the forest onto the main road. There was a park ranger at a checkpoint. I explained briefly what happened, showing him the footprint impressions. He listened and nodded grimly, explaining that sometimes people wander into restricted areas and can be dangerous, especially at night. He radioed for another ranger to check the area, and I was escorted safely back to the parking lot. I sat in my car for a long time, processing what had happened. The forest that had felt serene and beautiful the day before now seemed threatening, alive in a way I hadn't experienced before. I realized that my overconfidence in my camping experience had nearly put me in real danger. I had been careful with supplies and preparation, but I hadn't accounted for another human being with potentially harmful intentions. I was lucky. I had been observant enough to notice the footprints and alert enough to get out safely, but it could have been far worse. A few weeks later, I returned to the forest, but only to help rangers mark trails and ensure areas were safe for other hikers. The experience left me with a deep respect for wilderness and human unpredictability. I never camped alone at that level of isolation again. I invested in better safety gear: a bear spray, an emergency whistle, a GPS tracker, and I always let someone know exactly where I was going. I learned to read the forest more carefully, to watch for signs not just of animals but of humans who might be lurking. That trip became a turning point for me. I realized that camping and hiking weren't just about endurance or enjoying nature. They were about constant awareness and respect for the unknown. The forest hadn't changed. I had. And while I continued to explore remote areas, I did so with caution, preparation, and an understanding that nature is not the only danger out there. People can be just as unpredictable as the wilderness itself. From that day on, every time I hiked near creeks or set up camp in a clearing, I paused and looked around carefully, not just for animals but for subtle signs of human presence. The fear I had felt that night never fully left me, but it became a useful tool. It sharpened my senses, made me more aware of my surroundings, and kept me alive. What could have been a terrifying ordeal with a bad ending became instead a lesson in vigilance and survival. I never forgot the quiet fear, the snapping twigs at night, and the human footprints in the soft soil around my tent. But I also never forgot the relief of daylight and the clarity of a safe path out. It was a night that could have ended badly, but with careful observation, preparation, and determination, I had made it out alive. I kept every detail of that night in my mind: the sights, the sounds, the smells, and the tension. It became a story of survival, of learning to respect the forest and the unpredictable world of human beings within it. I returned to camping eventually, but never alone in the deep forest at night again. I stuck to safer, populated trails or made sure someone else was nearby. Every new trip carried lessons from that night. Always check your surroundings, always mark your camp, always be aware of signs of others. Nature is challenging enough, but people can add an unpredictable layer that requires even more vigilance. That night in the forest was a turning point in my approach to camping, instilling a level of respect, caution, and preparedness that I carry to this day. I had been planning this trip for months. I wanted a real escape, something far from the crowded trails near my town, something that would feel untouched, wild, and quiet. I had gone on hikes and short camping trips before, but this one was different. I wanted to test myself against nature alone, without the comfort of a busy campsite or other hikers. I packed my gear carefully. A sturdy tent, a sleeping bag rated for low temperatures, a small but reliable stove, enough food for 3 days, extra water, a first aid kit, a headlamp with extra batteries, and my trusty pocket knife. I even brought a detailed map of the area and a compass, something I rarely felt the need to use, but I wanted to be prepared. I left early in the morning. The sun was barely above the horizon, and the air had a chill that made me pull my jacket tighter. The drive to the trailhead was long, winding through forests and small streams, and then the last few miles were on a rough dirt road that tested my car's suspension. When I finally arrived, I parked in a small clearing, the smell of wet pine in the air, and an almost overwhelming quiet surrounded me. There was no other car, no other hiker, just the soft rustle of the wind through the trees. The trail started off easy, a clear path with soft earth and fallen leaves. The first few hours were pleasant. The sunlight streaming through the trees made patterns on the ground, and I passed small creeks and moss-covered rocks. I took pictures occasionally, careful not to disturb the wildlife. A few squirrels darted across the trail, and I saw tracks that looked like deer prints in the mud. Everything was normal, peaceful, but I could feel the wilderness closing in as I walked further, the sounds of civilization fading until all I could hear was the wind and my own footsteps. By midday, I reached a point where the trail split. According to my map, one path led to a lake, which was my planned campsite. The other went deeper into the forest. I took the path to the lake, eager to set up camp before dark. As I walked, the terrain grew rougher. The trail was narrow, and roots and rocks jutted out, forcing me to watch my step constantly. I saw evidence that people had been here before, old fire pits, a broken tent pole, but nothing recent. I felt slightly uneasy but brushed it off as normal for a remote area. When I reached the lake, the sun was starting to dip lower, and the air felt colder. The water was still and dark, surrounded by thick trees. It was beautiful, serene, and exactly the kind of place I wanted. I found a flat area near the shore to pitch my tent. The ground was soft, covered in pine needles. I set up my tent carefully, making sure the stakes were secure, then gathered firewood. The sun disappeared behind the trees while I was collecting sticks, and the temperature dropped quickly. I started a fire, small at first, then larger once I felt confident it was stable. The first night was peaceful. The stars were brilliant, more than I had ever seen near the city. I cooked a simple dinner, a tin of beans with some dried vegetables, and drank some water from my supply. I felt isolated but safe. The sounds of the forest at night were strange, a mix of rustling leaves, distant bird calls, and the occasional snap of a branch. I kept my knife close and my backpack within reach, but I felt confident. I fell asleep in my sleeping bag next to the fire, using it as a barrier against the cold and a small comfort in the dark. Around midnight, I woke suddenly. The wind had picked up, and my fire had died down to embers. I heard a noise, a scraping sound, like something moving through the leaves. I froze, straining my ears. At first, I thought it was a deer or a raccoon, but then I realized the sound was heavier, deliberate. Something was moving closer to my tent. I felt my heart rate spike, the kind of fear that makes you acutely aware of every sound, every movement. I reached for my headlamp and switched it on, scanning the area. The light caught nothing at first, just trees and shadows. Then I saw it, a large figure moving slowly, breaking branches as it came closer. My mind raced. It couldn't be a bear. I had heard them before, and their noises were different, more guttural. This sounded human. Someone was out there, approaching my tent in the middle of the night. I stayed perfectly still, my breathing shallow. My first thought was to wait, see if it would move away. but the figure didn't. It lingered, pacing near the edge of my light. Then I heard a faint, deliberate scraping at the side of my tent, where my backpack and stove were. My stomach sank. Whoever it was, they were searching my things. Panic rose, but I forced myself to stay quiet. I reached for my knife, thinking about my options. The forest was dense. If I ran, I could get lost easily. If I stayed, I could try to confront them, but I had no idea what they wanted or how dangerous they were. Minutes passed like hours. The sound moved away slightly, as if the person was circling, testing, waiting. I realized I had to act. Slowly, I grabbed my backpack, my knife, and a flashlight, making sure I didn't make noise. I unzipped the tent carefully and slipped out. The cool night air hit me, and I moved into the shadows of the trees, keeping low. I could hear the person again, closer this time, moving through the brush. My heart was pounding. I decided to leave everything behind and run for the main trail. I didn't know how far it was, but staying was not an option. I ran quietly, as fast as I could without making too much noise. The forest was dark, the trees casting long shadows. I stumbled over roots and rocks, scraped my hands on bark, but I didn't stop. Behind me, I could hear rustling, the crunch of leaves. They were following. I forced myself to keep moving, pushing through fear and exhaustion. Eventually, I reached the fork in the trail, the one I had passed in the afternoon. I took the path that led back to the car, hoping I could make it before they got closer. Hours seemed to pass as I ran. The trail was barely visible in my flashlight's beam. I had no idea how far I had gone, but I kept moving, guided by instinct and the dim light filtering through the trees. I kept thinking about what could happen if I stopped. If they caught me, I imagined the worst, and it pushed me to keep going. The forest seemed endless, and I began to doubt if I would ever find the car. My legs burned, my lungs ached, but I didn't dare slow down. Eventually, just before dawn, I saw a faint glimmer of metal and dirt. The car. Relief flooded me, but I didn't stop immediately. I crept closer, making sure no one was around. The forest was quiet now, almost eerily so. I reached the car, unlocked it with shaking hands, and slid inside. The engine roared to life, and I didn't hesitate. I drove slowly at first, then faster as I left the trail behind, checking the rearview mirror constantly. There was nothing there. No one had followed me. I was alive but shaken to my core. I didn't go back to that campsite. I didn't even tell anyone exactly where it was. I made it home, showered, and tried to calm down. I went through my gear later and nothing was missing, but I realized they had touched it, rifled through it. The thought of how close I had come, how unprepared I was for someone watching me, stayed with me for weeks. I couldn't shake the fear, the feeling of being hunted, even in the safety of my own home. But I learned something important that night. Preparation and awareness could save you, but in the wilderness, unpredictability is always present. You can plan and train, but you can never fully control what might happen. I never went back to remote camping alone again. From that night onward, whenever I go outdoors, I carry extra tools, extra lights, pepper spray, and I always check my surroundings. I stay alert, never assume safety. The memory of the quiet, dark forest, the sound of someone moving just beyond the firelight, and the desperate sprint to the car will stay with me forever. It changed the way I approach nature, the way I value safety, and the way I respect the unknown. Even though I survived, it was a reminder that wilderness is not just beautiful. It can be dangerous, unpredictable, and unforgiving. And the lesson I took from it: always respect the forest, always respect that there are others in it, and always be prepared, keeps me alive to this day. I had planned this camping trip for months, and by the time I finally reached the trailhead, I felt a sense of quiet satisfaction. I had left the city behind for a weekend alone in the woods, away from the noise, the stress, and the constant demands of work. My backpack was heavy, filled with all the essentials I could think of: a tent, sleeping bag, stove, water, a small first aid kit, a few cans of food, and some tools. I wanted to be prepared for anything because I knew that when you are alone in the wilderness, you can only rely on yourself. The trail started easy enough. It was wide and well-marked, the kind of trail that hikers of all levels used. The air was crisp, smelling of pine and earth, and I could hear the faint rustling of leaves as a gentle wind passed through the forest. Birds called out to each other, and somewhere in the distance, a woodpecker drummed on a tree. I felt relaxed, almost giddy with the freedom of it all. For the first hour, everything was peaceful. I walked at a steady pace, enjoying the sun on my back and the soft crunch of pine needles under my boots. After a while, the trail began to narrow. The forest thickened, and the light from the sun was filtered through dense branches. Shadows moved in ways that felt almost alive, and I found myself paying more attention to every sound. Small animals scurried in the underbrush, and the occasional snap of a twig underfoot made me tense up. I told myself it was all normal, that the forest was full of life, and yet there was a subtle tension in the air I couldn't shake. I found a good spot to set up camp late in the afternoon, in a small clearing surrounded by thick trees. The ground was flat and dry, covered in pine needles and small patches of moss. It felt isolated, but not unwelcoming. I set up my tent carefully, checking each stake and making sure the rainfly was secure. I arranged my sleeping bag inside, organized my gear, and made a small fire pit using stones I found nearby. I gathered enough wood for the night, some of it already dry, and stacked it neatly. As I sat by the fire later, cooking some of my food, the forest felt alive in a way that was both beautiful and unnerving. The wind moved through the trees, making a constant whispering sound, and the occasional animal call echoed eerily. I felt a thrill mixed with a slight unease. This was the solitude I had sought, but in its purest form, it was also intimidating. I reminded myself that I was prepared, that I had everything I needed to stay safe, and that I just had to remain alert. Night came quickly, as it does in the forest when there is no artificial light to stretch the day. The temperature dropped sharply, and the fire became my only source of warmth and light. I sat close to it, feeding small pieces of wood into the flames to keep it steady. Shadows danced on the surrounding trees, and every sound seemed louder and more distinct. A branch breaking somewhere in the distance made me tense, and I realized how sensitive my senses had become after hours in the quiet wilderness. I told myself that animals were active at night and that there was nothing to fear as long as I stayed aware. Around midnight, I heard something that froze me in place. It was a low, guttural sound, distant but deliberate. Not an animal sound I recognized, not the call of any bird or fox, but something heavier, more deliberate. Came again, followed by the crackle of twigs under weight. I stayed absolutely still, listening. My heart started to pound. Whoever or whatever it was moving toward me. I could hear it slow down, then stop. The forest became unnervingly quiet. Every instinct told me to grab my flashlight and investigate, but I knew that moving could give away my position if it was a human. I stayed crouched, watching the perimeter of the firelight. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours. The sound returned, closer this time, a deliberate, crunching step. My mind raced through possibilities. Could be a hiker lost in the woods, but something about the sound felt off. Too heavy, too controlled. My stomach knotted. I checked my backpack reflexively, fingers brushing the knife I had packed. I had learned through years of reading and research that in wilderness survival, preparedness wasn't just about food and water. It was about understanding threats and being ready for them. I thought about staying in the tent and making as little noise as possible, but the tent offered almost no protection against someone physically strong. The fire, oddly, seemed like both a beacon and a deterrent. Whoever or whatever it was would have to come closer to see or find me. I kept the fire alive, pushing it higher, trying to illuminate more of the clearing. Suddenly, a shadow moved at the edge of the firelight. Large, deliberate, and careful. It didn't dart like an animal, it moved with purpose, and my stomach dropped. Whoever it was, they knew I was here. Panic threatened to take over, but I forced myself to stay calm. I remembered my survival training. Assess, prepare, stay silent if possible, and never make rash movements. I slowly reached for my flashlight, trying to make sure my movements were deliberate but quiet. My hand closed around it, and I switched it on, pointing it toward the shadow. It revealed the outline of a person, tall, wearing dark clothing, moving carefully between trees. My heart raced. I could see the faint glint of a tool in their hand, maybe a hatchet or a knife. The realization hit me that I was facing a potentially armed intruder in the middle of nowhere. I knew my options were limited. I couldn't outrun them in the dark forest, and the firelight made me visible. I had to make myself appear more dangerous than I felt. I grabbed a large branch from the firewood pile, holding it like a club, and positioned myself where I could swing if necessary. Every sense was on high alert. The intruder stopped moving and crouched behind a tree, observing me. Time became elastic. I could hear every crackle of the fire, every whisper of the wind, every distant rustle of animals. The intruder made a step forward, testing the ground, then froze. I swung the branch in a wide arc, making a loud crack as it hit another piece of firewood. The sound echoed through the forest. For a moment, I thought it might provoke them, but instead, I saw movement away from the clearing. The shadow slipped back into the darkness. I didn't relax immediately. I stayed by the fire, flashlight in hand, until the first light of dawn began to filter through the trees. The forest felt almost normal again, but I couldn't shake the memory of the figure. I packed my tent, extinguished the fire, and started down the trail as soon as it was light enough to see clearly. My pace was fast, fueled by adrenaline and the desire to reach safety. Every sound, every rustle, made me tense, but I kept moving. When I finally reached the trailhead in the morning, I felt relief like a weight had been lifted. There was a parking area with a few other cars and hikers, and I saw the first signs of human activity in hours. I stopped, catching my breath, and took stock of my situation. Everything in my pack was intact, no damage to my gear, no injuries. The sense of isolation that had been thrilling the day before now felt like a distant memory. Later, I reported what I had seen to the local ranger station. They noted my description and warned me that while wildlife incidents were common, there had been occasional reports of individuals using remote trails for illegal activities. They advised me to stick to well-traveled paths in the future, never hike alone in isolated areas, and always let someone know your route. Reflecting on the experience afterward, I realized how quickly a peaceful adventure could turn threatening. I had been fully prepared for survival in nature, but not fully prepared for a human threat. I learned that awareness, calm thinking, and using whatever resources you have are crucial in such situations. I also realized the value of daylight and human presence. Both serve as protection when alone in the wilderness. From that trip onward, I adjusted my camping habits. I never camped alone in areas I wasn't familiar with. I carried extra means of signaling for help, and I always made sure someone knew exactly where I was. The forest had not changed. It was still beautiful, still full of life, but I had changed. I now saw the balance between the serenity of nature and the unpredictability of other humans, and I respected both equally. The experience became a clear lesson. Preparation, awareness, and respect for the wilderness and its dangers are as important as the desire to explore it. I still camp and hike, but I never underestimate the need for caution. Every sound and shadow in the forest now reminds me of that night. I carry my survival tools, plan my routes carefully, and maintain constant awareness. The fear I felt that night never fully leaves, but it serves as a guide, keeping me alert, safe, and ready for anything that might cross my path in the wild. And when I finally returned to the comfort of home, the contrast between civilization and the wilderness reinforces how precious safety is, and how fragile the line is between calm adventure and real danger.